Well, g'day curd nerds. Today we're making Persian Feta. Now, feta is a cheese that I've made many times before. I've made cow's milk feta, goat's milk feta, and the traditional Greek feta, which is a combination of goat's milk and sheep's milk. Now, the good thing is you can use any of those three recipes that I've got on the channel to make this cheese. So it doesn't really matter which type of feta you use. The Persian part of the feta is basically marinating the feta in olive oil, a bit of sunflower oil, and a whole bunch of spices and herbs. That's what makes, well, here in Australia, what we call Persian Feta. Now, let's go through the basics of making the feta first, and then near the end of the video, I'll show you how and what spices and what herbs I use to make the Persian Feta. Now, in this video, I also doubled the recipe that I normally would, and I use cow's milk exclusively to make a mild sort of feta, very mild indeed. Not very sharp, not very much sharpness to it, and that's what I kind of wanted to achieve. I wanted a nice mild cheese. I wanted it to absorb all the herbs and spices, all those flavors, and come up with a fantastic tasting cheese. All right, let's get on and see how we made Persian Feta.
So first of all, sanitize all your equipment. Also, I'm using milk by Inglenook Dairy today. It's the full cream unhomogenized version. The ingredients: use 8 litres or 8 quarts of whole cow's milk, a quarter of a teaspoon of lipase diluted in 60 millilitres or quarter of a cup of non-chlorinated water, an eighth of a teaspoon of MA11 or MO30 by Sacco. The MA11's by Choose It. It's mesophilic starter culture. 3/8 of a teaspoon or 2 millilitres of calcium chloride diluted in a quarter of a cup of non-chlorinated water. 3/8 of a teaspoon or 2 millilitres of single strength liquid rennet. I'm using IMCU 200, and that's diluted in quarter of a cup of non-chlorinated water. Also, you'll need a 10% brine solution, and the recipe for that is further on in the video. So once your milk is in the pot, then if you're using unhomogenized like I am, you'll find some of the cream may be a little bit solid, so just whisk that back into the milk and then clip your thermometer on. I've turned the heat on now, and we're going to heat the milk up. Now, if you get any bubbles like that on the top, that's no big deal. It's just caused by the milk fat. Now, before we go any further, we're going to add an ingredient. We're going to add the lipase, because this takes a little while to activate. So I'm adding it up front in the process. And just gently stir that in. So we're going to bring the temperature up now to 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit. So I'm just taking the pot off the heat before I do anything else, because I don't want the temperature to creep up during the cheese making process. Okay, so that's nice and settled. I'm just stirring any cream that's floated back on the top that was in the milk. And we're going to add in, before we do that, we'll just check the temperature. So a little bit over 30 Celsius, which is absolutely fine. It'll cool down during the culturing period. Now we're going to add in the starter culture now. This is the mesophilic starter culture. There's an eighth of a teaspoon, and just sprinkle that over the top. Now, because it's a direct vat inoculated starter culture, it needs to rehydrate now before we stir it into the milk. So do that for 5 minutes. So once the 5 minutes has elapsed, we're going to stir the starter cultures into the milk. So I'm only stirring for about a minute to make sure that they're well incorporated into the milk for this next phase, which is the ripening. So this is where the lactic bacteria that we've introduced converts the lactose, or the sugar in the milk, into lactic acid. So we're going to allow it to acidify for 1 hour. So 1 hour later, we're going to give that a stir, get the cream back into the milk again. Just a quick check of the temperature. It's about 30 degrees still, so that's okay. And now we're going to add the calcium chloride. Just pour that in while you're stirring. And now that that's stirred through, we're going to add the rennet solution. There we go. So stir that for no more than 1 minute. Okay, just still the milk and then cover it and allow it to set or coagulate for 1 hour. So an hour later, we're going to check it for a clean break. That's to see if the milk is set, and it has. That looks very good. Not too sloppy, quite firm under the knife. Now if you don't get a clean break straight away, then wait for another 10 minutes and then check it again. So I'm using my curd cutter. I'm going to cut into 1.25 centimetre or 1/2 inch cubes. So I just did the horizontals there. I'm using my curd knife to do the verticals. So you do it one way and then you do it perpendicular to the first cut. And we should have some nice cubes all the way around for luck. So we're going to allow the curds to heal for 5 minutes. This stops them from fracturing when you stir it for the first time. I see a little bit of whey seepage, which is good as we've cut the curds. Just gently stir. If you've got any big bits, now's the time to cut it with the side of the spoon. Just a quick check of the temperature. It's dropped down a little bit. I've turned the heat back on just for a few minutes, just to get it back up to 30. And we're going to stir the curds for 20 minutes. Now when you do this, don't forget that you've got the heat on, because you don't want the temperature going over 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit. So 20 minutes later, I turned the heat off long ago, and you can see the curd size is down to about the size of a peanut, which is spot on for this cheese. Now feta tends to have a fair bit of moisture in it. You don't want the curds any smaller than that. So pop the lid on. I'm going to allow them to settle for 5 minutes. This just makes it a little bit easier when we go to the draining. So over to the sink. Just take my boiled cheesecloth and put that over the colander. There we go, ready for pouring. Make sure your entire sink area is sanitized as well. So just transfer the curds into the cheesecloth lined colander. Quick wash of the hands, and we're going to allow those to drain for 5 minutes. Okay, so we're going to transfer the curds into a large feta basket. So I thought I would have to use 2, but I'm only using 1. I managed to fit it all into one basket. So that's a large rectangle basket, and it is lined with a cheesecloth to make draining a bit easier so I don't lose any of the curds. Now in my normal feta recipe, I would allow it to drain for 30 minutes before I put it into the basket, but I wanted it a bit moister for the Persian Feta. So that's why I only drained it for 5 minutes. Okay, so now we've got it all in there. We're going to put the cloth over the top. I'm going to use a very rudimentary press. Just press it down with my hands to start with. Just to get a bit of the whey out. So I'm going to top it with another basket of the same size. And because it's tapered, it will fit inside the other one. I'm just putting 4 litres of water, which is 4 kilograms, or 8.8 pounds of weight on top. It's a bit of a balancing act, as you can see, to start with, because it's quite firm. But persevere, you'll find a spot where it doesn't fall over. I'm going to allow that to press for 30 minutes. So I'm going to put the basket back on out of shot. Anyway, there it is. After the 30 minutes, kind of goes a bit wobbly, but carefully turn the cheese. Doesn't really matter what shape it is at the moment. It gets a lot smaller by the end of the process. So I'm just going to turn that over, make sure it doesn't all fall apart, and pop it back into the basket. You'll probably need to press fairly firmly to get it in there. Put the cloth over and then put the weights back on top again. And hopefully you can balance it enough. There we go. Now we're going to press for another 30 minutes. Okay, so 30 minutes later, you can see that the cheese has shrunk, and we're going to now carefully turn that over again. And we're going to put it back in the basket. And we're going to press it again. There we go. Now doing these short presses, we're going to press this one for an hour this time. These short pressings and rotating the cheese helps to not release any of the fat that's in the curds. You don't want cloudy whey. This ensures clear whey and you're not losing lots of the fat, which is essential to the ripening of the cheese. So we're going to take it out again, and we're going to carefully turn it over and press it for a last time. This time we're pressing for 2 hours. So I'm going to make a simple brine solution, 10% solution, 250 grams of salt, 2 litres of water, 1 teaspoon of calcium chloride, and 1 tablespoon of vinegar. Now you can freeze that to get the recipe for it. Now we're going to carefully undress the cheese, take it out of its basket, ready for brining. You can see it shrunk probably by about half its volume, which is fantastic. That's exactly what it should be. Just checking to see if it would fit in my ripening box, which I've kind of converted at the moment into a brining box. That's where I put the 10% brine solution. So I'm going to put it in there for 2 days and turn after the first day. It's a fairly light salt solution, so it won't absorb it too much. It won't absorb any more than is actually in there until it's all balanced. So after the first day, give it a turn just to make sure it's even. Now for Persian Feta only, we're going to air dry it for 1 day. Normally you could just store the cheese in the brine and eat it, and cut it off and eat it as you need to. But for Persian Feta, we need it quite dry before we marinate it. So I'm setting up my area. I've got a couple of jars there. I've got some herbs and spices, and we're ready to make the Persian Feta. So the herbs I've got is rosemary, thyme, fresh from the garden, some dried garlic, a couple of bay leaves, and some pickling spices. These can be usually found in the herbs and spices section of your supermarket. So we've got olive oil and sunflower oil. We need some of that to make up the marinade. And sanitize 2 1 litre or 1 quart mason jars or ball jars, whatever you want to call them. as long as they can be sealed. So I'm going to divide the spice mix. I'm pretty sure it's got pimentos, fennel seeds, some yellow mustard, and some coriander seeds are the spices that are in this. Just divide it evenly between the two jars. Just gives it a nice flavour. So then divide the dry garlic evenly between the two jars as well. If you use fresh garlic, there can be an issue, especially in oil, with botulism. So I would avoid fresh garlic and use dry garlic just to get that flavour, just a hint. So we're going to pull off a couple of sprigs of each of the herb bunches, just pop them in the bottom of each jar. So a little bit of thyme, a little bit of rosemary in a second. Leave the rest for later on for decoration. A little bit of rosemary there, popping in. There we go, not too much, leave the rest. And don't touch the bay leaves yet. So now we're going to make the marinade, the oil. Oh, before we do that, I forgot one thing, the most important thing, and that's the cheese. So we're going to cut the feta, which is fairly dry now, and we're going to cut it into 2.5 centimetre or 1 inch cubes. And we're going to place those into the jar or jars. So arrange them in the jars with the sprigs of herbs down the sides, and the bay leaf just makes it look nice. Not that we're selling it to anybody, it's just for our own personal consumption, of course. So push the cubes, as many as you can, in there, slip in the bay leaf into the side, and put a few sprigs of rosemary and thyme down the sides of the jars for a little bit of decoration there. And then repeat the process with the second jar. Now you won't fit all the feta into these two 1 litre jars. You'll get a fair bit. I would say 3/4 of the cheese, and the rest of the cheese can be put back in the 10% brine and eaten later on. So once again, put the bay leaf in, a bit of the rosemary, twigs in there. You could put some thyme in there as well. You can put chilies in. You can put all sorts of herbs and spices in there. Depends on your personal taste, of course. Anyway, trying to fit a few more cubes of cheese in. And top it with the rest of the herbs. That's all done. So pop that. That's going to go back in the brine. Just a bit of a quick taste test there. Cheese is absolutely delicious. Lightly salted, nice and creamy, not crumbly. So we're going to measure out the oils now. So I've already put 250 millilitres or 1 cup of the sunflower oil in. Now I'm pouring in the olive oil. So that takes it up to 500 millilitres or 2 cups. Blend them all together with a whisk, just quickly. And then fill each jar with oil, making sure that you cover the cheese entirely up the top. So there's a few air bubbles in there. We'll fix that up in a second. But like I said, make sure that you entirely cover the cheese. Now, if you should have just enough oil with that first batch for one. And then give it a bit of a tap, get rid of any air bubbles. And then seal it off with the lid. Rightio, that's the first jar done. And then make up another batch of the oil and do the second jar. Give it a quick whisk, and then fill up your Persian Feta jar with the oil. So I had a little bit of exposed cheese there, so I just pressed it down. There we go. There's both of them done. Absolutely fantastic. Now place them in the fridge at 4 degrees Celsius or 39 Fahrenheit for at least 2 weeks before you try some. I might be trying mine a little bit earlier, but 2 weeks minimum.
So as you can see, that wasn't very hard at all. Standard sort of feta recipe, and I suppose the culmination of all the flavours will come out when it has been marinated within a few weeks. Now I'm going to try a little bit in a week's time, and then I'm going to try another piece in 2 weeks' time. So these cheeses will mature in the kitchen fridge at 4 degrees Celsius. Whatever you do, don't put them in the pantry and leave them at room temperature because they can ferment. Now I've done this in the past and they turn out very, they taste terrible, basically. The lipase in them goes hyperactive, and basically you get some very sour, sickly tasting cheese. I prefer them to be nice and mild with just the flavours of the herbs and spices throughout them. So I'm going to keep them in the kitchen fridge. Now to stop your oil, the marinade, going all cloudy, that's the reason I used the sunflower oil, as you saw. So I used 50% sunflower oil and 50% olive oil, virgin olive oil. And that is just about the right ratio to stop the olive oil from going solid. So you get a nice clear oil, even at 4 degrees Celsius. Now, if you want to buy the kits to make this cheese, you can pop over to littlegreenworkshops.com.au. We've got feta kits online. And if you want to support the channel financially, don't forget that you can use the join button below to join as a YouTube member, or there are links to Patreon where you get extra benefits for different tiers of financial support. Well, thanks for watching, Curd Nerds, and I'll see you next time.